She is 15 years old, dressed in her finest clothes, and she will never go home again. That is not a metaphor. It is not the beginning of a story that resolves into something comfortable. It is simply what happened hundreds of times across centuries. Girls selected, examined, approved, and delivered to a place so vast and so sealed from the rest of the world that some of them would spend the next 60 years inside its walls without ever once touching what lay beyond them. Let your body settle wherever you are. The details will come slowly, and there is no hurry. The Forbidden City. 9,000 rooms, 72 hectares of polished stone and painted cedar, and golden roof tiles that caught the morning light and threw it back at the sky like a dare. From the outside, it was the most magnificent thing most people in China would never see. From the inside, it was something stranger and quieter and more complicated than its name suggested. This is not a story about emperors. It is a story about the women who shared their world, who were selected for it, shaped by it, sometimes broken by it, and sometimes, quietly, came to master it in ways no one anticipated and almost no one recorded. You are standing at the gate. The sky above you is the deep blue that happens just before sunrise, not quite dark, not yet light, suspended. Your breath makes small clouds that vanish before you can watch them go. The walls rise on either side of you, 40 feet high, nearly that thick, the color of dried blood in the half-dark. Beyond them, the world you knew is already receding. The city hums somewhere out there, past those walls. You can almost hear it. Almost. The gate closes behind you. And now you are here. Let us start with what people imagined, because the imagination is always the first thing that needs correcting. For centuries, the inner court of the Forbidden City, the private quarters where the imperial family lived, was spoken of in tones that mixed reverence with something more complicated. Thousands of women, all for one man. Endless luxury. A life of silks and jade and perfumed rooms, and a summons that might come at any moment, transforming everything. That was the story told outside the walls. It was not entirely wrong. It was simply selective. Like seeing the surface of a lake and deciding you understand the water. The women of the inner court were real, documented, and numerous. During the Ming dynasty, which ruled China from 1368 to 1644, records suggest the number of women housed inside the Forbidden City at any given time ran into the thousands. The Qing dynasty that followed maintained a formal system of hundreds of consorts arranged in a strict hierarchy of 8 ranks. At the very top, the empress. Below her, imperial noble consorts, concubines, and then rank after descending rank down to the lowest tier, women who had been selected and admitted but occupied a martyrist, status barely above that of a lady-in-waiting, their connection to the emperor theoretical at best. The silks were real. The jade was real. Some of the perfumed rooms genuinely existed, and some were magnificent. But the picture the outside world carried left out a few things. It left out the cold. The Forbidden City sits in Beijing, and Beijing winters are unforgiving. Temperatures dropping well below freezing. Icy winds crossing the vast stone plazas with nothing to stop them, nothing to soften them. It left out the bureaucracy, which was ferocious and detailed, and governed everything from what color you were permitted to wear, regulated by rank, to how many dishes could be served at your meals. Also regulated by rank, to who was allowed to enter your courtyard and when and for how long. And it left out the quality of the waiting, not waiting measured in days, in years, in decades, in a lifetime. We will get there. For now, the surface. the extraordinary, genuinely breathtaking surface of the most controlled and beautiful world in the history of the known world. Here is the first thing that surprises most people when they look closely. The vast majority of women who entered the Forbidden City as concubines never slept with the emperor. Not once. Not ever. This takes some unpacking. If the women of the inner court were selected as imperial consorts, why would most of them have no personal relationship with the man they nominally served? The answer is numbers, and the numbers are staggering. Picture a girl in a courtyard somewhere in Beijing. She is 14, maybe 15, dressed carefully. Her family has made sure of that. Palace officials move through the assembled girls with the quiet efficiency of people who have done this before. They look at her face, her posture, the way she holds herself. They write something down. And then, in a matter of minutes, it is decided. She goes back to her family, or she does not go back at all. This was the Qiu Nu, literally choosing females, a formal review held every few years under the Qing dynasty. Girls from Manchu bannerman families between the ages of 13 and 17 were required to present themselves. The process was overseen by palace officials, documented, thorough. Those selected were taken. Those not selected were free to marry. But being selected was not the same as being chosen in any personal sense. It meant entering a system. Most of these women were assigned as attendants to existing consorts or to members of the imperial household. They lived inside the Forbidden City, subject to its rhythms and its rules. But their relationship to the emperor was administrative. He would never know their names. Even for women who held the rank of official concubine, the probability of a summons on any given night was low. The formal system housed hundreds of women at any given time. All of them were technically part of the imperial household. Most of them were, in practice, not. The protocol for those who were summoned is remarkable. When an emperor wished to choose a bedmate for the evening, he was presented with a lacquered tray of small jade tablets, each engraved with the name of a consort. He turned over the one he chose. A eunuch went to retrieve the woman. She was carried to the imperial bedchamber, wrapped in a large red blanket, unclothed, to prove she was concealing no weapons. She would be unrolled at the foot of the bed. She would spend the night. And then, before dawn, a eunuch would come to escort her away. She could not stay. Not for breakfast, not to watch the sun come up, not even if she had conceived. The emperor's private chambers were his alone. No matter what had happened between them, she was gone before the light changed. Selected, examined, wrapped in red cloth and carried across the palace, then carried back. There is something in that image that resists easy summary. Something that requires sitting with. So what did the days look like? Most accounts, from eunuch memoirs to imperial records to the recollections of women who eventually left the palace, describe a world governed above all by routine. Rigid, relentless, beautiful in its precision, and quietly crushing in its constancy. You woke before sunrise. The palace ran on a schedule derived from centuries of ceremonial practice, and the schedule began early. Depending on your rank, you might rise to attend to a more senior consort, helping with her dress, her hair, her morning rituals. Or you might have attendants performing those tasks for you. Rank determined almost everything about the texture of your day. Morning meant grooming, and in the inner court, grooming was serious work. Manchu women in the Qing era wore a distinctive flat hairpiece called the liang batu, a wide horizontal wing of lacquered hair that required considerable skill to arrange properly. Consorts of high rank wore this, adorned with fresh flowers, with jade pins, with gold ornaments whose type and number were, again, regulated by rank. You dressed in robes whose cut and color and embroidery were all meaningful. You were, every morning, a visual statement. Your entire appearance was a text, and every element of it could be read. Imagine arriving in your new quarters and discovering that the number of candles permitted in your room is not a household matter. It is written in a document. That the ceramic your tea is served in is specified by your position in the system. That the number of dishes at your meals is a record that can be checked, verified, cross-referenced against what you actually received. Rank determined the texture of every hour in increments so precisely recorded they were committed to official documents that still survive today. And then, for most women in the lower ranks, came the long middle of the day. Lessons, for some, music, calligraphy, poetry, gardens to walk in during, permitted hours, visits between women of similar rank, conducted with elaborate courtesy, religious observances, the careful maintenance of relationships that might, one day, matter. The eunuchs need a moment here, because understanding the inner court requires understanding them. Men who served in the private quarters of the palace were required to be castrated, to ensure they could not father imperial children. By the height of the Ming dynasty, the number serving the Forbidden City had grown to somewhere in the tens of thousands. Some estimates suggest as many as 70,000 at peak. For women in the inner court, eunuchs were everything. Informants, messengers, gatekeepers, and almost universally, people who needed to be paid. A eunuch could carry a message to a more powerful consort. He could report your behavior, accurately or otherwise, to palace authorities. He could be paid in silver or silk or carefully placed favor to deliver information that might shift your position. Access to firewood for your room? Negotiate with the eunuch responsible for supply. Extra candles? Negotiate. A message delivered to a friend in another courtyard? Negotiate. They occupied a strange world of their own, neither fully inside the hierarchy nor outside it. And learning to navigate them, most women understood quickly, was the first real education the Forbidden City offered, and perhaps its most essential one. Here is where the story becomes something harder to look away from. Because inside all of that constraint, the ranked candles and the red blanket and the walls that cut the sky into rectangles, something else was happening. Something that resists the simpler version of this world, the one where all these women are only victims, and that is the whole of it. They were building lives, real ones, textured, particular, sometimes meaningful in ways that the institution housing them neither intended nor predicted. Within the inner court, relationships between women were often the most significant relationships of their entire lives. Senior consorts took in younger ones as something between a patron and a teacher, guiding them through the politics of the palace, shielding them from unfavorable attention, quietly advancing their interests. These were not always warm relationships. Rivalry was constant, and the stakes were high enough that sabotage was documented, and not rare. A woman who fell pregnant had a kind of temporary power that others did not. The competition for that position shaped everything. But alongside the rivalry was genuine intimacy. Shared quarters for lower-ranked women meant friendships formed the way friendships always do. Through time, through proximity, through the small currencies of kindness that matter most when your world is small. Women wrote poetry to each other. They exchanged gifts. They marked the same festivals, year after year. And those repetitions became something like continuity. Something that, in time, felt like home. The gardens were not incidental to any of this. The Forbidden City contained multiple garden complexes, most famously the Imperial Garden at its northern end, a compressed world of rockeries and ancient cypress trees and pavilions and goldfish ponds where the women of the inner court were permitted to walk. There is a cypress still alive in that garden today. It was old when the women of the Qing dynasty walked past it. They would have known it by its particular shape, the way its branches turned. They would have sat in its shade on summer afternoons. they would have watched snow collect in its needles in winter. Some women became accomplished painters. Some became remarkable poets. The inner court produced writing that has survived, verse that is quiet and precise, and sometimes achingly observant. The work of people who had learned to see carefully, because careful seeing was one of the few forms of freedom on offer. There is a particular kind of creativity that grows in confinement. It is not the same as the creativity that grows in open air. It is more condensed, more careful, sometimes more honest. The women of the inner court produced it in quantity, across 5 centuries of imperial rule, and much of it has been lost. What survives is enough to suggest that what was lost was significant, beautiful inside brutality. Or perhaps meaning found inside a system not designed to produce it. Both things were true at once, simultaneously, without resolution. Here is the thing that reframes everything that came before it. You might have been following this story thinking, these women had no power. They were selected, sorted, ranked, housed, and waiting. Their futures were determined by the turn of a jade tablet, or the accident of a pregnancy, or the length of a particular emperor's attention span. They were inside the most ornate cage in human history, and the cage was the whole story. And then you learn what happened when an emperor died. The death of an emperor triggered a redistribution of power so total, so sudden, that the entire inner court was renegotiated in a matter of days. Consorts who had not borne children faced genuinely bleak futures. Some were sent to temples to pray for the dead emperor's spirit, spending the remainder of their lives in something close to monastic confinement. Some were required to live out their years in their palace apartments without advancement, without much purpose, without change. But consorts who had borne sons, and particularly the woman whose son was chosen as the new emperor, did not merely survive. They ascended. The mother of a new emperor became Empress Dowager. Her rank became the highest rank in the entire empire. Her word carried the force of imperial command. Her political influence, once she learned to exercise it, was limited only by her own skill and the coalition of officials arrayed against her. This happened repeatedly throughout Chinese history. But the Qing dynasty produced perhaps its most extraordinary example. A young woman entered the Forbidden City in 1851 as a concubine of modest rank, near the lower tier of the 8-rank system, far from any obvious path to influence. She was 16 years old. Her family was unremarkable by the standards of the bannerman class. Nothing about her selection marked her as exceptional. She bore the emperor a son, the only son who survived infancy. When that son became emperor, she became Empress Dowager. When he died young, she engineered the selection of another child emperor, one she could more effectively guide. She ruled China, officially or from behind a curtain, for nearly half a century. She directed foreign policy. She outmaneuvered generals and diplomats and threatened powers that had never imagined she existed when she arrived at those gates at 16, in her fine clothes, with her whole future already decided for her. She was Empress Dowager Cixi. She died in 1908 as the last real authority of the Qing dynasty, which formally collapsed 3 years after her death. She had not been designed to happen. The system had not intended her. But she was not alone. This is the part that matters most, and the part history most reliably forgets. Cixi was the most visible instance of a pattern that repeated itself across 5 centuries. Women arriving unremarkable, learning the grammar of a world built to contain them, and then, when the moment arrived, speaking that grammar back in a voice no one had expected. The inner court produced these women again and again, and it was perpetually, bafflingly surprised by what they did with the time it gave them. Waiting is not passive, not always. Sometimes waiting is a form of preparation so long and so quiet that the people who benefit from your stillness never once notice it is happening. Let us not soften the next part. The lives of women in the inner court cost them things that cannot be recovered. Most of them arrived as teenagers. The selection system was not designed to be cruel. Families often considered selection an honor, and some families maneuvered specifically to have daughters considered. But it was a transaction conducted without the girl's meaningful consent. You were assessed. You were taken or returned. If taken, you left. The family you came from, the city you knew, the future you might have built in some ordinary way, all of it receded behind those walls. The isolation was real in a way that is difficult to convey at this distance. Beijing lay just outside, a living city of theaters and markets and ordinary human movement, and the women of the inner court could not touch it. There were rare, formal occasions when imperial processions moved through the city, and there are accounts of women watching from palanquins as the streets went by, the whole city moving past them like something seen through water. Close enough to see, nowhere near close enough to touch. The competition could turn vicious, and did. Records describe accusations of witchcraft, a woman accused of using dark arts to harm a rival. Poisoning allegations, fabricated scandals, eunuchs bribed to intercept letters or deliver damaging information. Not every woman in the inner court was someone's enemy, but most women were, whether they wanted to be or not, someone's rival. The structure made it so. The structure had always made it so. And then there was the grief specific to this world, the grief of outliving your relevance. A woman who had once been called to the emperor, who had perhaps borne children, who had organized her entire interior life around proximity to power, and then aged out of it. In the later Qing period, the palace maintained elderly consorts in their quarters for the rest of their natural lives. You would not starve. You would not be thrown out. You would remain in your ranked apartments with your ranked furnishings, while everything that had given those ranks meaning slowly receded into the past. Some women died in the palace, having entered it 60 or 70 years before. They had outlived multiple emperors. They had outlived generations of rivals and friends. They had watched the dynasty itself begin to crack around them. And they died inside the walls, the same walls they had entered as girls barely old enough to understand what was being asked of them. This is the part that sits heaviest, not the drama of intrigue. That at least had motion to it. The weight is in the stillness, the years that passed without summons, without urgency, without the sense that any of it connected to something larger than the machinery of the institution itself. And yet, they built something, not in the grand dynastic sense, though the dynasties they served were grand, in a quieter sense, in a sense that persists. The culture of the inner court was a culture. It had its own aesthetics, its own forms of knowledge about what it meant to live with profound constraint and still insist on being fully human inside it. Women in the inner court passed understanding to each other across generations, not only the political knowledge of how to survive, but the knowledge of how to make something worth having from what you had been given. Their written records survive imperfectly, but they do survive. Poetry that describes winter light on a courtyard wall, letters between women whose friendship had lasted 30 years inside the same set of walls, whose handwriting would have been as familiar as a face. Calligraphy practiced until it became extraordinary, not because anyone required it to be extraordinary, but because the person holding the brush required it of herself. These were small, determined acts of self-insistence in a system that did not especially require you to insist on anything. They held the emotional infrastructure of the imperial family together across centuries. They raised the children who became emperors. The influence of a mother, even one who never exercised formal political power, moved forward through time in the character and instincts and fears of the men she had raised. The palace understood this implicitly. The selection of wet nurses was formal and scrutinized. Access to an imperial child was known to carry influence, and the system tried to manage it even as it kept producing outcomes it had not planned for. And some of them rose. Not most, not easily, never accidentally. But the inner court was not a sealed room from which no woman ever emerged with power intact. It was a proving ground of an extraordinarily specific kind, and the women who navigated it with both intelligence and patience sometimes emerged as some of the most formidable people their era produced. History recorded them mostly in relation to the emperors they served or the sons they bore. Their own names, their own particular stories have required significant scholarly effort to recover. That work is still happening. Some of those names are still being found. You are standing in that courtyard again. Early morning. The sky above the Forbidden City is the same deep blue as when you first arrived. Not quite dark, not yet light. The moment suspended between the two. Your breath makes small clouds. The walls rise on every side, ancient, painted red, the gates closed. The city hums somewhere beyond them. You know this now, though. What those walls contained was not one story. It was thousands of them. Women who arrived terrified, and women who arrived with ambition already quietly forming. Women who spent their entire lives in patient obscurity, and women who turned the same walls into the foundation of something extraordinary. Women who found each other in gardens and shared quarters and the slow accumulation of years, and built friendships that outlasted emperors. Women who wrote down what they saw and what they felt and what they understood, and tucked it somewhere, hoping that one day someone might find it and know that they had been here, that they had been real, that the life inside these walls had been theirs even when the system tried to possess it entirely. The cypress in the imperial garden is still there, the one they knew by its shape, the one whose shade they sat in across generation after generation. It has outlived every emperor who ever slept behind these walls, every empress, every consort and concubine and lady-in-waiting who ever walked past it in the morning light. It is still growing, slowly. It is still there. Something about that steadies me. A tree that witnessed all of it, the jade tablets and the red blankets and the ranked candles and the private grief and the unexpected power and the long, long waiting, and is still just a tree, still catching the same morning light, still standing in the same quiet garden. Because here is what those walls could not contain: the small, persistent act of remaining yourself inside a world that expected you only to be what it required. The women of the inner court did this, each one in her own way, in her own language, across 500 years. Most of them were never recorded. Most of their names are gone. But they were here, and it mattered that they were here, and something of what they built is still standing. If this kind of story is what you're looking for, other worlds, other lives, the people history almost forgot to keep, subscribe, and there will be more. Let the walls recede. Let the city beyond them go quiet. Let the gates close gently, the way they always did, the way they always will. The morning light is gold on the roof tiles now. The cypress stands still in the garden, its oldest branches barely moving. Somewhere in that vast and silent place, someone is sleeping. It is enough. It is entirely enough to simply be here, to simply rest, to let this world, and all its weight and all its grace, drift softly, slowly, gently away. You are somewhere warm. You are somewhere safe. Let everything go.